welcome back to this special conversation with perhaps India's best economist this far, Dr. Amartya Sen. Well, Dr. Sen, you have been, and I would think rightly critical of this preoccupation with economic growth, a GDP growth of 8% or whatever. And somewhere in your book, you also point out that the tragedy of this form of development is that more Indians have cell phones rather than have toilets. Would you say, therefore, there has been some trickle down of economic growth?
Oh, huge amount. I've never denied that. I'm not saying growth is not a very important objective. It absolutely is. I'm saying, A, growth is important because it improves living standards of people. In 1776, in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith discussed the issue of growth. He didn't call it growth, he said economic progress. He said, why do we seek it? He said, one, it increases income of people, which allow people to do what they would like to do. And two, it gives the government the resources that only economic progress generates to be able to do those things which the government alone can do in terms of public services. Second thing is that in order to have sustained economic growth, but there's also extreme importance of having healthy, educated labor force. That's a point that the Japanese seized in 1860s, immediately after Meiji Restoration, 100 years after Smith, but they were, in terms of practice, leading the world. Europe had done it much more slowly. Japan wanted to do it straight away, within 3 decades. And then came Korea, then came Taiwan, then came Hong Kong, Singapore, to some extent Indonesia and Thailand. They all fall, and now China in a big way. All of them have followed a method which Indians simply did not appreciate the value of. And when people were saying, you were saying earlier also, left had been very dominant, some people describe India as a socialist policy. What socialist policy? Half the country illiterate, half the children underfed. And that's not a socialist policy, and no health care. I mean, with all kinds of worse tyranny, when the left produced that tyranny, and I think Stalinism was a tyranny, but they did have education for all. And if you look at the Soviet Asia, you can pick up which countries was in the Soviet Union, because they have much higher level of literacy and longevity. They did that thing, but none of that happened. So India didn't have a socialist economy. India had a intrusive governmental system which did not care for the poor, only to some extent, and it catered pretty well for the middle classes. We did fine IITs, yes, fine IIM, and we had great success. India was beating the world in information technology and pharmaceutical and management. People go and manage, yep, the Deutsche Bank, and people go and manage Microsoft. But it wasn't any socialist, but it was a governmental interference, yes, with some positive effect. These are all great achievements, which I'm referring to. But on the other hand, there's a big neglect. Now, in order to have sustained economic growth, you need education and healthcare. So my point isn't that growth is unimportant. My point is growth and development have to be simultaneously planned. What I don't like is the idea that you do one, have high growth rate, and then you do education and healthcare, because that's not the way you could sustain economic growth.
My criticism of you was not that you were anti-growth at all. My point was merely to ask you whether you see growth doing at least some good to India. That was my limited point. I completely agree that you have never spoken against growth.
No,
I agree. I wanted to specifically
good to India, yeah.
I want to specifically ask you, you have pointed out that 3 Indian states, Himachal, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, clearly stand out in terms of per capita economic growth, per capita income, as well as education. Yeah. So what have these states got right that other states can emulate?
Well, I think basic understanding that growth and development are hugely complementary. I mean, it's not a new understanding. It is Adam Smith, 1776, for God's sake. Even on we're discussing things like food security, healthcare, and so on. how to run it. There are lots of things, as Smith pointed out, the government alone can do. At very small expense, he said, the government can make everyone literate, educated. Similarly, healthcare. Similarly, safety net, social safety net. So it's a question of understanding what the government can do well, what the government can't do well at all, and discriminate between them, and not just be pro-government or anti-government.
On that issue, sir, you have raised a lot of angst, correctly, against the quality of government-provided education in so many schools in India, village and not necessarily village, even in urban areas. Government teachers don't turn up. It is an autocracy all their own. So somewhere in India, government is not even rendering that public services properly, which is why even the poor turn to expensive private education rather than free government education.
Right. You're pointing your finger at a very important issue, but we can win that through cooperation, not by just busting the union or saying privatize, because no matter how you privatize, a lot of the poor people would not be able to go to school. No country has ever moved to full literacy or to full health coverage on the basis of private education and private health alone. Not a single country in the world.
Well, let me come to the food inflation in India. We've had food inflation for 5 years now at double digits. Any thoughts on this? I mean, how did we get ourselves into this rut?
Well, I think we have to take it on. You know, that's an economic policy thing. I think this is an issue that has to be addressed at the fiscal level as well as at the financial banking level. Now, I'm Raghuram Rajan, who is the Reserve Bank governor. I think a number of things he has said are very salutary on that. By the way, also this important economic growth, he recently get a major lecture, which I'm glad that it was Financial Times and others played it up, that when we had in 2009, when there was this attempt of 2008 or 9, forgotten, when the G20 first came in, we all committed to maintain high growth rate to support each other. And India and China and Indonesia and so on did that, and Brazil. But now that it's needed, somehow America said, we don't need it anymore. So I think Raghu was absolutely right to complain about it. Similarly, his idea that inflation has to be brought down without getting the growth rate come down too, because growth is important. Now, Raghu doesn't talk about education and healthcare, because that's not his remit.
No, he can't.
On the other hand, I'm sure that we would agree on that education and healthcare are extremely important for the expansion of economic growth. So I think we have to think, I don't have a magic formula, but is it a very important issue? Yes. And does it get less attention than it should? Yes. I think the suffering from food inflation is very large. On the other hand, are we using all the ways through which it could be improved? The situation could be restrained. I think we were not, and now I think we are doing more. And I think probably we can do a lot more too, paying a particular attention. But we have to bear in mind, look after food inflation in general, at the same time look after economic growth, look after economic development, and bear in mind the long-term relationship between growth and development. That's the totality of the picture.
Absolutely, that's a common minimum program